Rain pounded the cracked pavement, drumming a frantic rhythm against the roofs and splintered windows of the neighborhood. The street lamps flickered in the gray twilight, casting long, trembling shadows that danced across puddles stained with oil and dirt. A small figure barreled through the wet streets, her soaked hair plastered to her tear-streaked face. "They're beating my mama," she screamed, voice raw and trembling, echoing against the brick walls like a desperate plea that shouldn't have to exist. Her tiny fists clenched and unclenched as she ran, slipping in the mud, her sobs ripping through the night like shards of glass. From a few blocks away, Officer Ramirez was finishing his patrol when the sound tore through the drizzle, a shrill, piercing cry that made his heart stutter. Instinct pulled him forward before his mind could catch up. And then he saw her, her little body shaking, eyes wide with a mix of terror and hope, pointing toward a darkened doorway where muffled thuds and anguished groans pressed against the walls. The world narrowed to her in that doorway to the terror no child should ever carry, and something deep in him, an unspoken promise he'd never made, ignited. Somewhere in the shadows, a police dog whined, tense and alert, sensing the same danger that had rooted itself in the girl's trembling frame. Time seemed to slow. Every raindrop, every echoing footstep, every gasp and whimper mattered. He could feel it in his bones. This night would change all of them forever. The rain came in sheets, heavy enough to sting exposed skin, turning the cracked sidewalks into rivers of muddy water that lapped at the edges of the curb. Street lamps flickered against the storm, their yellow light pooling in the puddles like trembling ghosts. Somewhere in the distance, a car's tires hissed against the slick asphalt, but it was drowned almost immediately by the shrill, raw scream of a child. The sound tore through the night, slicing through the rhythm of the rain and echoing between the tight rows of brick houses. "They're beating my mom to ground," the girl cried, her voice breaking and urgent, a sound so desperate it made the air itself seem heavy with panic. Her little feet splashed through puddles, sending droplets flying like shattered glass. Each step was frantic, unsteady, slipping on the slick stones of the sidewalk, yet she pressed forward, propelled by a force greater than fear, pure necessity, a child's instinct to run toward safety when everything else had gone wrong. Her soaked hair clung to her forehead and cheeks, her dark eyes wide, glistening with tears that mixed with rain, streaks tracing paths down the dirt-smudged skin of her face. Her coat, too big and worn, hung limply on her small frame, and the edges of her shoes dragged through the mud, leaving wet, irregular prints that marked the urgency of her flight. Every step she took was punctuated by gasping breaths and sobs that seemed almost louder than the rain itself. Officer Ramirez had been finishing the last sweep of his patrol route, the rhythm of his boots muted against the wet asphalt, when that scream cut through the night. It wasn't just the sound that froze him. It was the clarity of it, the pure terror contained in those three words. Something primal stirred in him, a tug that ignored procedure, ignored caution. His hands tightened on the steering wheel of the patrol car for a fraction of a second, then released as he stepped into the rain, letting it soak through the thin fabric of his uniform. He moved faster, adrenaline sharpening each sense, the scent of wet concrete, the tang of ozone in the air, the slick drag of rainwater down his neck. The girl was only a few blocks away now, darting past abandoned stoops and the occasional shuttered window, her small frame zigzagging to avoid puddles large enough to swallow her shoes. The street was nearly deserted, except for the occasional whimper of a stray dog or the hiss of the wind whipping through the alleys. And yet, despite the chaos of the storm, her presence felt monumental. She was a beacon of panic and hope. And Ramirez's chest tightened as he realized the urgency of what he was about to step into. He could hear the faint thud of someone striking something inside a house ahead, muffled and irregular but unmistakable. Each sound pressed against him like a pulse, a warning that the world had narrowed to the small girl and whatever lay behind that closed door. The girl skidded to a stop when she saw him, her tiny chest rising and falling with rapid, uneven breaths. She pointed, her fingers shaking, trembling from both cold and fear. "They're hurting her. My mama," she shouted, voice cracking like breaking glass. Her sobs made her words almost incomprehensible, but the desperation in her tone needed no translation. Ramirez took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, though his stomach had already knotted tight. He squinted through the rain, seeing a faint flicker of movement through the curtain of the doorway she indicated. A shadow shifted inside, and with it, a muffled cry that made his throat tighten. From somewhere nearby, A low growl rolled through the air, a warning primal and sharp. The police dog, Max, moved at Ramirez's side, ears pricked, muscles taut beneath his slick, rain-soaked fur. He didn't need to see the danger to sense it. Every hair on his body stood on end. Ramirez knelt slightly to meet the girl's gaze, trying to convey some fraction of reassurance, though he knew there was little he could do at this distance. "It's going to be okay," he said, voice steady despite the storm and the pounding of his heart. "I'm going to take care of her." He could feel the girl's trembling intensify, but she nodded, small and hesitant, as if willing herself to believe him for a moment. He approached the house, each step measured but fast, the water sucking at his boots with every stride. The front door was ajar, and through the thin sliver shadows danced violently, contorting against the flickering light of a lone bulb inside. The smell hit him first, a sharp, acrid tang that made his stomach lurch, mixed with the faint, unmistakable scent of fear. He signaled Max, and the dog's tail stiffened, eyes locked on the threshold. There was no hesitation, only purpose. Ramirez could hear the girl behind him, her sobs muffled now as she crouched under the overhang of the porch, watching, waiting, hoping. The wind gusted, sending rain sideways, soaking them both, but Ramirez barely noticed. Every sense was narrowed to the doorway, to the sounds of struggle and the faint, frantic noises of someone being struck. He placed a hand gently on the girl's shoulder, giving her a steadying squeeze. "Stay here. Watch the dog," he said softly, his tone carrying authority and reassurance in equal measure. He didn't look back, didn't give her a chance to change her mind. With Max at his side, he stepped across the threshold, feeling the slick wood of the porch beneath his boots, the tension in the air like static electricity. Inside, the darkness was thick, almost tactile, pressing against his senses. The muffled cries grew louder as he moved closer, each one punctuated by harsh, uneven thumps. Max's growl was low and warning, vibrating through the floorboards and into Ramirez's chest. Every instinct screamed at him to act, to close the distance, to get to the source of the terror before it escalated further. And then, almost imperceptibly at first, he caught a glimpse of her, the mother, pressed against the wall, shaking eyes wide with disbelief and fear. Ramirez's pulse spiked, and in that instant every protocol, every training manual, every rule melted away. The girl's voice rang in his ears again, sharper this time, nearly piercing the storm outside. Please make it stop." Her small, frantic cry was a tether, pulling him forward with relentless force. Ramirez exchanged a glance with Max, whose lips curled in a silent snarl, eyes shining with an understanding that needed no words. They were going in together. The rain, the storm, the world outside, it no longer existed. Only the doorway, the shadowed figure, the terrified mother, and the small girl waiting in the rain remained. And as Ramirez moved forward, the first thought that struck him was simple and human. She would not be hurt on his watch. Not tonight. The moment Ramirez crossed the threshold, the house swallowed him whole. The rain that had hammered the streets outside was now a distant drum, replaced by a suffocating stillness, punctuated only by muffled whimpers and the harsh scrape of something being thrown against the floor. The dim bulb above flickered, casting long, erratic shadows that clung to the peeling wallpaper like silent witnesses. The air smelled sharp, metallic almost, and there was the faint undertone of something sour, unwashed, as if the fear in the house had seeped into every corner and surface. Ramirez's boots made soft thuds on the threadbare rug, each step deliberate, every muscle taut with anticipation. Max moved just ahead, tail low but rigid, eyes sweeping every darkened corner, every slit of shadow, reading danger in ways human eyes could not. The mother's voice, weak, ragged, and desperate, sliced through the gloom. Please, no more. It was barely audible, as if spoken through a throat raw from sobbing, but it carried a weight that made Ramirez's chest tighten. He froze, taking in the scene as it unfolded in fragmented glimpses. Against the far wall, the silhouette of a man loomed, obscured by shadows, his movements jagged, unpredictable. He struck again, once, twice, and the mother flinched, curling inward like she was trying to fold herself into nothing, an impossible task for someone trapped in that small, suffocating room. Max growled low, a deep vibrating sound that seemed to make the walls themselves shiver. The dog's hackles rose, and his muscles twitched, coiled for action. Ramirez signaled subtly, a barely perceptible nod. and Max moved with precision, a fluid, instinctive force. The officer's heart pounded in rhythm with the tiny, panicked breaths of the mother and the steady, tense energy radiating from the dog. Every instinct Ramirez had was screaming, "Act now." The shadow shifted as the man turned, and for a fleeting second, the dim light caught his face, twisted with anger and disbelief. Ramirez could see the taut line of his jaw, the wild flare of his nostrils, the veins standing out in his... And then in a blur of motion too fast to track with the eye alone, he struck again. The mother cried out, a sound that tore into Ramirez's chest, pulling at something raw and unguarded inside him. He moved a step faster, boots sliding slightly on the threadbare rug, heart hammering, hands ready to subdue, to protect. Max lunged first, a controlled, precise attack that shocked the man and threw him off balance. The dog's teeth were out, not biting recklessly, but pressing forcefully, enough to command attention, enough to create a pause, a disruption in the chaos. The man staggered, yelping, more startled than hurt, giving Ramirez the split second he needed. He closed the distance in 2 strides, grabbing the man's arm, twisting with practiced control, every movement calculated, but not devoid of anger. Not devoid of the human weight of witnessing terror inflicted on someone who had done nothing to deserve it. The mother pressed herself into the far wall, trembling, her hands covering her face. Her eyes peeked through trembling fingers, wide and wet, tracking every movement with desperate hope. Ramirez glanced at her for a heartbeat, offering a silent, grounding presence, then refocused on the immediate danger. Max was still taut, ears forward, tail stiff, ready to intervene again at the slightest motion. The man struggled, the sharp edge of panic rising, but the combined presence of officer and dog created a force he could not overcome. There was a moment of stillness almost unbearable, where every breath seemed magnified, every raindrop from the leaking roof outside echoing in their ears. The man's shoulders slumped slightly, his defiance faltering under the weight of authority and instinct. Ramirez took the chance, voice firm but not cruel. "It's over. Step away." The words were simple, grounded in law, but carried the weight of human consequence. Max barked sharply, the sound slicing the thick air, reinforcing the order with a feral insistence. The mother's sobs intensified, half relief, half disbelief. She pressed herself closer to the wall, her knees trembling, her body still rigid from shock. Ramirez moved to her side, voice gentler now. "You're safe. He can't hurt you anymore." She looked up then, and for a fleeting moment, recognition and gratitude mingled in her tear-filled eyes. She opened her arms slightly, a gesture of tentative trust, but still cautious, still haunted by the violence she had endured. Ramirez stayed close, but his attention never left Max, never left the fragile equilibrium of the room. Outside, the storm had softened to a drizzle, a gentle patter now that seemed almost surreal against the intensity of the scene inside. Each sound from beyond the door, the wind, the faint hum of traffic, was a reminder that life continued, indifferent to the human chaos within these walls. But inside, every second was a lifetime, every glance, every motion, a negotiation of survival, fear, and authority. Ramirez could feel it, the slow, delicate thread of control beginning to stretch, but not yet snap. The man was subdued now, hands pinned, anger and disbelief etched across his face, but he was no longer a threat. Max's growl softened into a low, watchful rumble, tail sweeping in controlled arcs, eyes never leaving the subdued figure. Ramirez finally allowed himself a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, shoulders easing slightly, though the adrenaline still hummed like electricity through his veins. Turning toward the mother, he saw her trembling subside just enough for her to take a tentative step forward. Her eyes, still wide, were now tracking his with cautious recognition, a silent question. Will this end? Ramirez knelt slightly, meeting her gaze without condescension, without forcing words she might not yet be ready to hear. "It's over now. You're safe." His tone was steady, deliberate, and though the room still carried the residue of fear, of violence, it was a beginning. A fragile beginning. Max nudged the mother gently, sensing her need for reassurance, a protective presence that transcended words. She flinched slightly at first, then, in a small hesitant movement, allowed the dog's closeness, leaning into the warmth and solidity he offered. Ramirez observed quietly, noting the subtle shift, the micro-movements of trust forming in the space between trauma and safety. The storm outside faded further, softening to a gentle drizzle that tapped the windows with delicate insistence, almost like applause from the world beyond. acknowledging the fragile triumph inside. The mother sank slowly to the floor, knees drawn up, head resting against the wall, and finally allowed herself to exhale. Her body shuddered with the force of emotion she had held back for too long. Fear, relief, disbelief, gratitude, each tremor a small victory. Ramirez stayed close but gave her space, understanding that the silence between words often spoke louder than any sentence could. And in the corner, Max lay down, ears still pricked, eyes alert, a silent sentinel who had understood the stakes better than anyone. The officer exhaled fully for the first time, letting the tension roll off his shoulders in slow, deliberate waves. Outside, the drizzle had begun to pool in the cracked sidewalk again, reflecting the dim lamplight like liquid gold. And Ramirez knew, deep down, that this night had shifted something fundamental, not just for the mother and child, but for him as well. In the quiet aftermath, he allowed himself a small glance back toward the doorway where the little girl waited, soaked, shivering, eyes wide. She had been the spark, the catalyst that pulled everyone into this moment of reckoning. And he knew that, as long as she had that small, indomitable voice, the fragile hope that had begun to bloom inside this house could survive even the storm outside. The house was quiet now, but it was the kind of quiet that hummed with tension, the residue of fear and adrenaline hanging in the corners like dust motes in a shaft of light. Ramirez could feel it in the taut muscles of the mother pressed against the wall, in the tiny, uneven breaths of the girl who had dared to run through the storm, in Max's low, vibrating growl as the dog remained coiled like a spring ready to act. Every sense Ramirez had was sharpened, attuned to the possibility that danger could erupt again, that the fragile calm was nothing more than a pause between storms. He stepped closer to the mother, crouching slightly so he could meet her gaze without looming over her. "We need to get you both out," he said softly, but with a firmness that carried authority without cruelty. The mother nodded slowly, eyes still wide, tears glinting in the flickering lamplight. She was trembling, but there was a spark now, a tiny ember of relief and hope that hadn't existed when Ramirez had first entered. He could see her weighing each movement, calculating whether the promises he offered could be trusted. Max nudged the mother gently, sensing her hesitation, and she flinched at first, but then allowed the contact, leaning slightly into the dog's warmth. Ramirez used the moment to glance at the man who had caused the terror, still pinned, still straining, still full of that raw, angry disbelief. There was no more room for negotiation. Action was required, precise and controlled. He signaled to Max with a subtle hand movement, and the dog shifted instantly, moving to the threshold like a shadow that belonged to no one but Ramirez. The first step outside was the hardest. The mother clung to Ramirez's arm, small hands gripping tightly, knuckles white. The girl stayed behind momentarily, watching, eyes wide with a mixture of awe and fear. Ramirez turned slightly, giving her a reassuring nod, and she finally moved forward, running to join them, boots squelching through the wet hallway. The reunion was brief, a shared exhale of relief, but Ramirez could feel the tremors of lingering fear. It clung to them like a second skin, heavy, unshakable. Max led the way down the narrow hallway, nose to the ground, ears twitching at every sound. The drip of water from a leaky ceiling, the faint creak of floorboards, the soft gasp of the mother as her fear flared with each step. Ramirez followed close, hands ready, eyes scanning the shadows for any sign that the storm inside had not yet passed. Outside, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. The world softened into gray and silver reflections. The door opened with a reluctant groan, and a chill wind swept in, biting, wet, cleansing. The mother dropped to her knees in the mud, gasping, trembling, finally allowing herself to cry. The little girl wrapped her arms around her mother's waist, shivering but holding on, and for a moment, Ramirez let them be. Max sat at their side, ears alert, tail sweeping the ground slowly, a living shield. The officer breathed in the cold, wet air, letting the night wash over him, letting the chaos of the last minutes settle like sediment in a jar. But he knew the rescue was not yet fully complete. There was still the man, still the paperwork, still the legal boundaries that must be navigated. And yet, for that fleeting moment, all that mattered was that two lives were safe. The mother's sobs began to soften, replaced by whispered reassurances to the little girl, words trembling but meant to hold weight and warmth. The girl buried her face in her mother's coat, finally quieting, finally feeling the faint pulse of security that had been absent all evening. Ramirez knelt beside them, hand resting lightly on the mother's shoulder, feeling the residual tension that still clung to her like ivy. He spoke softly, deliberately. "You're safe now. No one can hurt you tonight." Max shifted, sniffing the ground around them. Ears pricked, and Ramirez noticed the dog's attention lingering on the shadows at the edges of the street. The threat had passed, but instinct remained, the residue of danger etched into muscle memory. He allowed himself a brief glance at the girl, whose wide, wet eyes now reflected the dim lamplight, mirroring the first spark of trust that had begun to form. She reached for Ramirez's hand hesitantly, small fingers brushing against his, a silent acknowledgement of safety and gratitude. The night stretched on around them, quiet except for the soft patter of rain and the occasional distant hum of traffic. Ramirez helped the mother to her feet, supporting her as she steadied herself, and the little girl ran ahead, puddle splashing in that small, determined way that children do when the world suddenly feels less threatening. The mother allowed a small, grateful smile, one that carried more relief and exhaustion than joy, but it was enough. Enough to mark a beginning. Enough to mark the difference between terror and safety. As they moved toward Ramirez's patrol car, the rain lightened to a mist, clinging to hair and clothing, casting everything in a silvery haze. Max trotted beside them, a protective force that never wavered, eyes scanning the shadows, ears twitching at every faint sound. The little girl glanced back at the doorway one last time, then forward at the open car door, the hesitant spark of hope flickering in her gaze. Ramirez felt the weight of the night pressing on him. The raw, unfiltered emotions, the fear and relief, the brief electric moments of terror, but also the quiet, undeniable affirmation that courage, persistence, and instinct had made a difference. Inside the patrol car, the mother finally slumped against the seat, exhausted, trembling, tears still streaking her face. The girl nestled close, tiny arms wrapping around her mother's waist, fingers gripping fabric as if anchoring herself to reality. Max sat outside the car, alert but calm, breathing slowly, muscles relaxing slightly as the immediate danger receded. Ramirez watched them both for a moment, feeling a quiet satisfaction mixed with lingering worry, knowing that while tonight had ended in safety, the echoes of fear would take time to fade. He glanced at the girl, still clutching her mother, and smiled gently, a quiet, grounding gesture. "You were very brave," he said softly. The words carried weight, not patronizing, not hollow, but sincere. The girl's lips twitched, a hesitant acknowledgement, and for the first time since the scream had pierced the rain, there was a tentative sense of relief, of trust, of possibility. The night continued to settle around them, the storm dissolving into mist and wet streets gleaming under the weak glow of street lamps. Ramirez closed the door to the patrol car, giving Max a subtle command to follow, and the dog obeyed instantly, brushing past the mother and child as if acknowledging his role in their safety. The mother held the girl tightly, rocking slightly, whispering words of comfort, and Ramirez let them be, understanding that the rescue was only the first step in a longer journey of healing. For Ramirez, the night was quiet again, but not peaceful. The adrenaline still hummed, the sense of urgency lingering in his veins. The image of the shadows and the mother pressed against the wall burned into his mind. But as he sat in the driver's seat, listening to the soft whimpers and muffled sniffs of relief inside the car, he felt a rare, quiet satisfaction. Tonight they had survived. Tonight the little girl's voice had not been ignored. Tonight courage and instinct had carried them through. And in the silver haze of mist and rain, that was enough. The morning light was soft, muted through thick gray clouds, casting a silver haze over the neighborhood streets that were still slick with last night's rain. The air smelled faintly of wet earth and asphalt, sharp and clean, and it carried a strange calm after the storm, as if the world itself had exhaled. The mother sat on the edge of the small couch in the modest living room, knees drawn up, hair still damp from rain and anxiety, staring into the middle distance. Her hands trembled slightly as they rested on her lap, and her eyes, once wide with terror, now reflected a quiet, wary relief. The little girl sat beside her, brushing strands of wet hair from her face, her small fingers clutching a frayed doll with a grip that was both protective and uncertain. Ramirez leaned against the doorway, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes scanning the room without intruding. The dog, Max, lay near the window, ears twitching at distant sounds outside but otherwise still, the muscles under his slick fur slowly loosening as the tension of last night ebbed away. The mother glanced up, catching his gaze briefly, and a fragile, almost imperceptible nod passed between them. a wordless acknowledgement that they were safe, that someone had carried them through the night when the world had felt like it was closing in. The girl finally spoke, her voice small, tentative, almost swallowed by the vast quiet room. Mama, is it over?" Her words trembled with uncertainty, as though she had been rehearsing them in her mind for hours, maybe days, before finding the courage to ask. The mother wrapped her arms around her, holding her close, rocking slightly. "Yes, it's over," she whispered, voice rough from crying, yet steady enough to offer the anchor her daughter needed. They clung to each other, a living testament to survival, and Ramirez watched the subtle exchange of energy between them, the unspoken transfer of fear, relief, love, and cautious hope. Outside, the streets glistened with wet light, the puddles reflecting the soft gray sky. Ramirez had stepped onto the porch briefly, letting the chill seep through his uniform, grounding him in the calm after chaos. He could still feel the adrenaline humming in his veins, a residue of fear and action, but it was tempered now by the quiet satisfaction that came from knowing lives had been spared. Max padded to his side, nose nudging at his hand, eyes meeting his with that familiar silent understanding that had carried them through the house the night before. Ramirez crouched, ruffling the dog's fur, and allowed himself a faint, private smile. Back inside, the mother was beginning to move with slightly more confidence. She tidied the small living room, gathering scattered items that had been knocked over in the struggle, but she did so slowly, deliberately, as if each movement was a step toward reclaiming her space, her agency. Agency. The little girl mirrored her mother's actions in miniature, picking up dolls, rearranging cushions, her small body moving in careful, purposeful motions. Every gesture was layered with emotion, the quiet reclamation of normalcy, the tentative stitching back together of a world that had briefly unraveled. Ramirez remained in the doorway for a long while, watching without interfering, sensing that this was their moment, their fragile space to begin recovery. He noted the subtle shifts, the mother's shoulders, once hunched tight with fear, loosening fractionally, the girl's hesitant smile when her doll was placed back in a safe corner, the way Max's eyes softened as he watched the human family reclaim a sense of safety. It was delicate, incremental, yet profound. Healing, he realized, didn't arrive in grand gestures. It crept in quietly, through gestures, breaths, glances, and the slow erosion of fear. At one point, the mother finally looked up, eyes meeting Ramirez's. There was gratitude there, yes, but also a weariness that weighed heavier than any words could express. She spoke softly, voice trembling but firm. "A thank you for coming, for saving us." Ramirez inclined his head, voice low, deliberate. "It's my job. But you were brave, both of you. Very brave." He didn't elaborate, didn't offer platitudes. The quiet sincerity in his tone was enough. The mother nodded, tears welling briefly but held back, as if she were carefully rationing them for the moment, and in that pause, the room seemed to breathe with them. The little girl finally approached him, eyes wide but calmer, still tracing the contours of his uniform with curiosity mixed with lingering awe. "And the dog?" she asked softly, almost as if the presence of Max had been as vital to her survival as Ramirez himself. Max wagged his tail gently, moving closer to her, allowing her to pat his head with small, cautious hands. The dog's eyes met hers, warm and steady, carrying a quiet reassurance that words could never capture. She smiled then, a tentative, fragile smile that was more about relief than joy, but it was the first real sign that the trauma of the night had begun to loosen its grip. Time stretched slowly, each moment deliberate and quiet. The storm outside had fully passed, leaving a damp, cool world of reflections and misted windows. The mother and daughter moved together, exploring the space with tentative steps, reclaiming corners of the house, and Ramirez remained a watchful presence, understanding that the act of rescue was complete, but the work of recovery was just beginning. He observed small gestures, a brush of fingers across a tabletop, a rearrangement of a fallen picture frame, a glance exchanged between mother and child that spoke volumes without words. Eventually, Ramirez rose to leave, but before stepping out, he offered a final glance. "It's going to take time," he said softly, "but you're not alone anymore. You have each other, and that's stronger than you think." The mother nodded, voice barely audible but resolute. "We'll remember that." The little girl waved shyly, her small hand trembling, and Ramirez allowed himself one last smile before stepping into the silver-gray morning. Max followed, shaking rain from his fur, ears pricked at the new sounds of the world outside. ready to resume vigilance but understanding that the immediate danger was past. As he walked toward the patrol car, Ramirez could feel the weight of the night settling, lingering in his chest like a quiet echo. He knew the images, the fear, the terror, would not fade immediately for the mother and daughter, nor would the echo of the dog's presence or the officer's reassurance disappear from their minds. But the first step had been taken, and in the fragile, tentative way that survival allows, a seed of healing had been planted. The storm outside mirrored the storm within, now dissipating, leaving space for growth, for quiet resilience, for the slow reclamation of life. Looking back once, he saw the mother and daughter at the window, watching him go, shadows softening in the early light. They were not unscathed, not untouched, but they were together. And sometimes Ramirez thought, that is enough. A week had passed since the storm, yet the streets still carried a faint shimmer from last night's rain, reflecting the soft gray morning light in pools along cracked sidewalks. The neighborhood had returned to its usual rhythm, children laughing faintly in the distance, cars humming along uneven asphalt. But the world felt subtly different, quieter, as if holding its breath for those who had survived chaos. Inside the modest home, the mother and daughter were moving through their morning routine with cautious deliberation. Breakfast was quiet, almost ritualistic, the clinking of spoons and the soft hum of the kettle filling the small kitchen with comforting, ordinary sounds. The mother's hands trembled slightly as she poured tea, a subtle, lingering reminder of the week's trauma. Her eyes, though, were clearer now, focused, carrying a fragile resolve she hadn't had before. The little girl sat at the table, knees swinging under the chair, dark hair tousled, but eyes alive with the cautious brightness of curiosity, the beginnings of trust slowly knitting themselves into her small frame. She glanced occasionally toward the door, where the faint reflection of the street beyond reminded her of the storm that had passed, both outside and within. Ramirez and Max appeared at the curb, silhouettes softened by the silver morning light. The officer had come not out of duty this time, but because he understood the weight of presence in healing. Sometimes the smallest gestures could carry the largest comfort. Max padded forward, tail sweeping gently, ears alert but relaxed, his eyes flicking between the girl and Ramirez as if measuring the world in human and canine beats. The little girl's face lit up with a tentative smile, small hands clapping together quietly, a mix of excitement and relief. "Good morning," Ramirez said softly, voice careful, deliberate. He stepped onto the porch, letting the damp chill seep through his uniform, grounding him in the moment. "How are you two holding up?" The mother exchanged a glance with her daughter, both weighing the question. Then the mother spoke, voice low but steady. A little stronger each day," she admitted, her lips curling in a subtle, weary smile. The girl nodded, gripping her mother's hand tightly, a silent promise that they would face the world together. Max nosed the girl's shoulder gently, prompting a laugh that was small but genuine, a sound that had been absent during the storm and the immediate aftermath. Ramirez allowed himself a private relief, the kind that builds quietly in the chest, warmed by knowing that life, however tentative, had reclaimed a foothold in their hearts. The mother knelt slightly, brushing a stray lock of hair from her daughter's face, eyes softening as she studied the small curve of her child's smile. Every gesture, every breath, seemed weighted with new meaning, a reclamation of life and trust that had been threatened but never fully extinguished. They walked together to the small park across the street, the girl skipping ahead, boots splashing in lingering puddles, Max trotting beside her like a shadow of loyalty and instinct. The mother followed, shoulders looser, breath steady, carrying with her the faint but persistent echo of survival. Ramirez kept a careful distance, aware that his presence should be protective but not imposing, allowing the mother and daughter to occupy the space of their own recovery, while silently witnessing the subtle, slow flowering of trust. In the park, the little girl paused at a bench, tracing the wet wood with small, damp fingers. She looked up at Ramirez, eyes bright but tinged with lingering caution. "Do you think it will be okay?" she asked softly, voice trembling slightly. Max nudged her again, and the girl laughed, the sound light, fragile, but undeniably human. Ramirez crouched to her level, meeting her gaze with steady eyes. "It will be," he said simply. "It might take time, but you're not alone anymore. You have each other, and that's stronger than anything else." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of lived experience of fear, faced and survived. The mother sat on the bench beside them, drawing the girl close, inhaling the faint scent of wet hair and soap, a comforting anchor in the aftermath of storm and trauma. She watched Ramirez and Max with a quiet gratitude that didn't need words. Life would not be untouched by what had happened, but the first threads of normalcy were weaving themselves slowly, gently, into the fabric of their days. The mother's hand rested on her daughter's shoulder, fingers entwining, a tactile reassurance that would outlast any spoken promise. For a long while they simply sat together, the mist from the park settling like a soft veil over the world, the air carrying the faint scent of wet grass and concrete. Max lay down at their feet, ears twitching occasionally at distant sounds, a sentinel of calm and protection. Ramirez remained standing a few feet away, hands in his pockets watching them. He could feel the subtle shift, the difference between survival and living, between fear and cautious hope. It was fragile, yes, but undeniable. And sometimes, he reflected, that fragile thread is all that is needed to rebuild a life. As the day slowly brightened, the girl finally released her grip on her mother and ran a few steps ahead. Boots splashing through a lingering puddle, laughter breaking the heavy silence like sunlight through gray clouds. The mother followed, eyes softening, lips curved in that small, weary smile, catching up to her daughter and wrapping her in a tentative embrace. Ramirez allowed himself a small, private sigh, a rare moment of quiet satisfaction. He knew the journey ahead would not be easy. He never deluded himself about the lingering effects of trauma. But he also knew that courage, presence, and trust had begun to carve a path forward. The wind shifted slightly, carrying with it the scent of damp earth, fresh rain, and the faint tang of city streets slowly waking. Max lifted his head, ears pricked, then rested them again, watching the mother and daughter with quiet attentiveness. Ramirez reached down, patting the dog's head gently, feeling the warmth of connection between human and canine, a bond forged in action, trust, and instinct. It was a small miracle, quiet but profound, that in the midst of darkness and fear, loyalty and courage had created a space for hope to grow. The little girl paused, turning to glance at Ramirez and Max, her eyes bright, her small lips curling into a smile that was at once shy and certain. "A thank you for everything," she whispered. The words were soft, carried on a fragile breeze, but they carried the weight of recognition, of gratitude, of survival. Ramirez inclined his head, voice low and sincere. "You're welcome. Remember, you are stronger than you know." As they walked home, hand in hand, Max trotting close beside them, the city seemed softer somehow, the light gentler, the shadows receding just enough to hint at possibility. Ramirez stayed a few steps behind, allowing the mother and daughter to reclaim the space of their own lives, understanding that sometimes the greatest gift is presence without interference, protection without overreach. And as he watched them disappear down the street, small figures moving with cautious freedom and tentative hope, he felt a quiet, undeniable truth settle in his chest, that even in the darkest nights, a light can persist, small, fragile, but unyielding. The rain had passed, the storm had ended, and in the gentle silver morning, life was quietly, irrevocably moving forward.